I'm Pastor Todd. This is Pastor Will. We've been talking about race and worldview and systematic injustice. And we've got a hodgepodge of things to cover in this section if we have time. It just goes to show that there's really a lot to talk about. But we'll start with the sort of like the modern narratives that are going on and how they shape our perspective. Like the media is going to be a big influencer, right? Because they're the ones that get to say things. Social media can be an influencer too. Mm-hmm. So I guess the question is like, do you perceive patterns and an agenda? And what should we be watching and watching out for?
Sure. Well, I mean, another way to ask this is just to say fake news.
Yeah, sure.
And just to bring up that thing right there.
Wow. Yeah.
Because that's you hear that a lot. So the question is, does the news have bias? And I guess.
Do we have to answer that?
Yeah. The question behind the question is, do people have bias?
That's true.
Right.
It's true.
Which is yes.
And where does it comes from? Their ethnic history, their interpretation of the world, the privilege or the lack thereof. Yeah, absolutely.
So I think the question isn't what is the most trustworthy news source. The question is you need to understand that all of the news sources are going to have varying degrees of emphasis and focus. And the only way that you can really know what's true is if you acknowledge that about them all.
Yeah.
And with this whole idea of fake news, with particularly the issue of violence against African Americans, there is a narrative that the news is somehow fabricating or making this up.
Or highlighting certain things but diminishing other things.
Sure. What I find so interesting about this is the reason that this has become a subject for the national discourse is not because it wasn't a subject in the African American community. It wasn't like the idea of violence being perpetrated by those in authority or with privilege against African Americans what is a clear subject of conversation pre-cell phone video. Mm-hmm. So when we in the black community we have something called the talk, and it's not the one you think. It's not about the birds and the bees. Mm. It's about you're about to get your driver's license, and you need to understand how to conduct yourself so that you'll come back home.
You're talking about, just so that we're clear.
Sure.
Because I'm seeing in my mind my white friends being like, I have that talk.
Sure.
But what you're talking about is because of a history.
Yeah. Because of a history of violence.
Because of a history of violence against African American folks, you have to give more specific warning to your children than maybe I ever have. I don't know. I don't know if I've ever had that conversation.
Yeah. So it was brought to so my wife is white, and so when I explained to her the thing, even to the placement of registration, everything is calculated so that in the event that I am pulled over for some reason, I want there to be zero suspicion.
So you can't put something in the glove box?
No.
Or under your seat?
Nah, man, we put it in an advisor.
Right, where it's very
so I can see it. And I feel like people think, well, that's silly or something to that effect. But the fact that is such an important conversation should at least point to something. And the fact that the conversation was being had before there was cell phone video should also be an indicator that there was something wrong. And so there has not necessarily been an increase of violence against African Americans. There has been an increase of the documentation.
The exposure.
Because people can have a camera in their pocket.
Right, yeah.
And so before there was even a counter narrative that these videos were being used to further some sort of racial divide. Before that was a thing, there already was and exists the narrative that because you of the color of my skin, I have to have an increased awareness, a sensitivity to make sure that I am never perceived of as a threat. And what I think is important to understand is that if you are a minority living in some majority, you have to study and understand the majority, because that is the world in which you navigate.
Say that again.
Yeah.
Because that's an important idea.
If you are a minority living in the majority and you are going to have some sort of upward social mobility in whatever sector it is,
right,
you are going to have to study the majority culture.
And a good example to sort of remove it and change tone is like you lived in China for a year.
Yeah.
And that would apply. Like if you go to China, you're not going to have automatic success and opportunity, even if you know the language well, just because you're an American.
Right.
Like you're going to have to know something about the nuances of the ethnic worldview, what works, what doesn't. So you bring that back home, and it's still the case.
Yeah. But W.E.B. Du Bois, he calls it the double consciousness. The double consciousness is that I'm African American, two, I live in a majority white society, and I have to be conscious of both of those things at the exact same time, because I understand that I'm navigating in a world that wasn't created for my upward mobility. And so I am going to have to be even more careful to, in some ways, appease the majority to be seen as someone who is quote unquote safe, which is a burden that if I was not a minority, I would not have to bear.
Yeah, I can see you have to watch what you say, who you say it to, how you say it, because of the implied potential. I'm not saying like it's a risk for everyone, but there is much more of an on-guardedness that would have to take place. You don't know who you're talking to.
A really good example is the subject of anger.
Okay.
So, how does my being angry get perceived? Right? Now, everybody gets angry sometimes. Right? But there can be certain displays of aggressiveness that can be seen as, man, he's a tough dude. That is applaudable. Right? Yep. But then for those with my tone of skin, aggressiveness or assertiveness can be seen as a threat or as a danger.
Absolutely, yeah, I can see.
And so like you live with this consciousness,
which is interesting. Like talking about narratives in a predominantly white man's world, dressing up like you're about to go play Call of Duty in the woods with all your buddies and walking around with guns, for some reason, that's not a threat. It's applaudable. Oh, such good Americans. But an African American with a gun, arrest him immediately, convict him of a crime, just because he had a gun. There's like a level of that. That might be an extreme.
No.
There's a level of that.
Just to paint it even more clearly. So, I'm sure you've heard of the Black Panther Party. Okay, so the origin of the Black Panthers was to police the police in the African American community. And so they took advantage of the Second Amendment, right? And they would just stand by arrests. They would stand there just to be like, yo, we here.
Just to make sure
everything's okay. Now, the moment when they decided to go to a government building with their large weaponry, that was a moment where everybody was afraid and saying, oh, this is horrible, you shouldn't do this. Like, you can just Google it.
Yeah.
You can see the pictures. And so that picture is completely in my mind when I see people going to government buildings because they want to get haircuts with guns, and it's like this, and it's okay.
Yeah.
They're fighting for freedom.
System of injustice.
Yeah.
There's racism that's inconsiderate, uninformed. There's ethnic history. There's a narrative. All of these things play a huge factor, and if we're not aware of them, we can jump to a conclusion so fast and say completely insensitive, if not full-on racist things, and not even know that we're saying it because of a lack of perception. So this is really helpful.